Hello and welcome to the video about convict transportation from Whitchurch to Australia. Transportation began in the 16th century and prior to 1770 was to America. In 1770, Captain Cook claimed the east coast of Australia for Britain. It was found to be suitable for a penal colony. In 1787, the first fleet of 11 convict ships set sail for Botany Bay. Transportation hit its peak in around the 1830s, and in 1868 the last convict ship arrived in Australia. Between 1700 and 1740, the British population had remained steady, but it started rising considerably in 1740. By 1776, London was overcrowded, filled with the unemployed, and flooded with cheap gin. Crime had become a major problem, and in 1784 a French observer noted that from sunset to dawn, London became the patrimony of brigands for 20 miles around. By 1800 there were 220 crimes with mandatory death penalty, and theft of over 12 pence was one of them. The Judgment of Death Act of 1823 made the death penalty optional, but they still wanted a deterrent. This made transportation very favourable. The Industrial Revolution also had a part to play in this. The social displacement it caused led to a major increase in petty crime. This led to a severe overcrowding in the jails. 80% of the people in jail were there for theft, thus the hulks from the 7 Years' War became prison ships. This situation, alongside the discovery of Australia, led to increased transportation compared to previous penal colonies. Crimes that had transportation as a sentence were damaging the Westminster Bridge, cutting down trees, stealing livestock, stealing anything worth more than 5 shillings, which is about £30 today, pickpocketing, the destruction of turnpike roads, general poaching, stealing from a shipwreck, and being out at night with a blackened face, which made people assume you were a burglar. Certain crimes wouldn't lead to transportation. This included murder, espionage and treason, which all resulted in the death penalty. Piracy and the forging of wills and the forging of the power of attorney would also result in the death penalty, and prostitution, which resulted in a short prison term with hard labour. So far, we've identified 2 men and 5 women who were living in Whitchurch and were transported between 1828 and 1843. 2 women and 1 man from the surrounding area were also transported during that time frame. Thomas Cook is probably the most well-known convict from Whitchurch in Australia. Thomas Cook was born in 1812 and was the son of John and Mary Cook, a cooper and his wife. The Cooks lived and worked at the Olde Shoppe. He was enrolled at the National School in the Old Town Hall. In May 1826 he was employed at William Hills Watson, Esquire, a solicitor, and upon William's death started working under Benjamin Lakin in September 1828 as a solicitor's clerk. Thomas Cook became friends with a Mr. Thomas Richardson, who lived opposite Mr. Lakin's office. In 1830 the farms around Whitchurch were caught up in the agricultural revolution, and several were set alight. One of the individuals involved in putting out the fires was William Churton, an auctioneer and relative of Thomas Richardson. Richardson and Cook wrote a threatening letter to Mr. Churton regarding the fires, and in what would be a mistake, signed it Captain Swing. Late in 1830, Richardson was arrested due to his handwriting being recognised. He swiftly turned in Cook. Both were placed in jail until Wednesday the 30th of March 1831, where they underwent trial at the Shropshire Lent Assizes in Shrewsbury. This was at the point when public opinion over the agricultural revolution was low. Richardson and his family all testified that it was Thomas Cook who was behind everything, and that he had been the mastermind. Other members of the town who didn't speak at the trial weren't so sure. The year after Thomas Cook was transported, Richard Whitfield, a farmer and maltster, was convicted on a separate charge of sending threatening letters to Lord Hill at an earlier date than the letters Cook was arrested for. He was the mastermind behind that scheme, and was subsequently connected to Thomas Cook's crime as well. Articles in 1832 say Cook and Whitfield were the masterminds for Churton's letter, but Whitfield alone was the mastermind behind Hill's letters. Could Whitfield have been the sole mastermind behind Cook and Richardson? After a trial that lasted 7 hours, they were found guilty, and the next day Richardson and Cook were sentenced. Thomas Richardson, due to having a wife and 9 children, was treated leniently and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. Thomas Cook was sentenced to 14 years transportation, at which point his mother cried out and his father quietly wept. Cook was bound in chains and taken to the Hulk Leviathan in Portsmouth. Many people had problems with the sentencing and felt Cook was being treated too harshly, probably due to him signing it as Captain Swing. This led to a petition being written and signed by over 150 people of the town, famous names including the Nunleys, the Joyces, the Morrells, the Edgerton and the Smiths. This, alongside character references from the curate, reverend and the head gaoler at Shrewsbury Jail, were all sent to Whitehall to ask for Cook's sentence to be commuted. Whilst on the Hulk Leviathan, Thomas Cook worked at Portsmouth Dockyard during the day. Whilst there, he was led to understand the petitions and that a few years on the Hulk might see his crime being commuted to time served instead of having to go for transportation. Unfortunately, the hulks were cramped and poorly ventilated, leading to ill health, and Cook decided that he wouldn't survive staying on the Hulk to find out about the results of the petition. Upon being visited by a Mr. Capper, who wanted to make him a ship's clerk, a more bearable placement, he requested to be transported on Mr. Capper's ship ahead of the petition's decision instead. Thomas Cook was introduced to the Surrey's surgeon, Dr. Colin Browning, as a man of good character by the Leviathan's keeper. This led to him being Dr. Browning's clerk for the voyage, which Cook notes as a very favourable journey, with the other convicts being well behaved and educated by the surgeon whilst at sea. Dr. Browning took Thomas Cook to the authorities in Port Jackson and prevailed on them his good character, setting him up as a clerk in the office of convicts. Thomas Cook quickly became colleagues with a Mr. Green, the storekeeper. Soon afterwards, a new keeper of the barracks arrived called Mr. Slade, who wished for Mr. Green's position and thus conspired against Green to lay charges against him, one of fraud and another of conflict of interest, as Mr. Green also owned a shop in the town. Thomas Cook found and gave evidence that had the first charge removed, and Mr. Slade swore revenge. Unfortunately, Mr. Green stepped down due to the conflict of interest, and Mr. Slade got the position. He called muster and charged Thomas Cook with disrespect, sending him to the road gangs. Several people tried to stop this transfer, but Mr. Slade took his complaint even higher up the chain of command, so Thomas Cook was sent to the mountains. The sleeping huts there were poorly built, and the convicts only had a sheet of bark for a mattress, half of a threadbare blanket, and a log for a pillow. The huts were draughty and let the cold in, so convicts would have to warm themselves by the fire several times during the night. Rations were stolen, and accusations against the overseer, who was also a criminal, were met with false charges and lashings by the inspector. The coldness of the night and isolation led to many of the men becoming involved with each other, and any man who objected to this behaviour too strenuously was beaten, and if they persisted in causing a fuss, was falsely charged and punished by the overseer. Thankfully, after a while, George Morley, an acquaintance of Cook's from Port Jackson, took Thomas Cook on as a clerk for 6 weeks, as his current clerk was ill. Cook was treated well and ate at the family table. Upon finishing this position, he was given a food parcel and sent to a new road gang. Upon arrival at this new road gang, Thomas Cook was quickly caught up in a new problem. Some cows had been killed by someone in the road gang, and the meat was found in the cabin which Thomas Cook shared. This led to the whole cabin being marched to the magistrate. Upon arrival, they were deposited in a lean-to by the courthouse. This structure offered no protection against the cold, and due to a clerical oversight, the men were kept there for 2 weeks in the winter time, causing some to lose digits to frostbite. After 2 weeks, Cook wrote a letter to the magistrate asking about the delay, and upon realising that the men were still there, the charges were subsequently dropped. Upon their return to the camp, it became apparent that the overseers had figured out a new scheme. The men had realised that as long as there was no obvious involvement in a crime, they were free. The overseers formed a group of select convicts to waylay travellers and kill random cows. The men could leave the gang and the others would have to cover their work for them. The situation worsened until the press were reporting on it, so the overseers needed to place the blame on someone. The select group killed some cows near the camp and mentioned it in passing to some of the more innocent members of the road gang, who, due to their hunger from the select group stealing their rations, went to salvage some meat from the bodies. They were followed and stumbled upon by the overseers and blamed for all of the crimes. These scapegoats were all sentenced to death, and by this time interest in the area amongst the media had faded, and the gang had been reassigned. The road gang were all assigned to various households in White Rock. Thomas Cook and one other member were assigned to an older gentleman who despised convicts. The man had an assigned convict who shared this sorry tale. He had worked for the man for a time, and was coming up on getting a ticket of leave, but the man didn't want to lose him, and so falsely charged him with impertinence a week before he was eligible for a ticket of leave. This got him some lashings and another year of work added before he could reapply for a ticket. This has happened twice before. Upon helping finish the harvest at White Rock, Thomas Cook was assigned to be a clerk again. He worked well and kept his head down, but unfortunately someone else in the office forged a letter for which Thomas Cook was blamed. He was sent to Port Macquarie to join a work gang. Whilst there, he received a letter from home. The barracks were poorly watched, and Thomas Cook, feeling homesick, started looking at escape. Thomas Cook snuck out one night, but alerted the guard, and as such snuck back into his bed. The next night he tried again, and got out of town. He went to a house that he knew would help, and was given directions to a shelter, and was partnered with a sailor for his escape. First, they went west to Broken Bargo Mountain, where the sailor hurt his leg. They then limped south near Dingo Scrub Forest to the Manning River. Then they went to a supply station on Kangat Mountain, but it was abandoned, so they went on to Gloucester, then Tellygerry, where the two men split up. Cook followed the Williams and Patterson rivers towards Maitland, where he was recognised and arrested. He slipped away again and found refuge at a granary whose owner removed his cuffs. He was recaptured in Wallarobba and marched back to Maitland. Due to his escape, Cook was sentenced to life on Norfolk Island, the isolated island jail for the worst of the worst. There was a failed mutiny before he arrived, and the guards were vicious in their response, ignoring if a convict was involved or not. They clubbed one man into idiocy and threatened doctors who were treating the wounded. Those jailed for the mutiny were punished constantly for 5 months by floggings, beatings, and occasional stabbings, with no mercy from above. Thomas Cook, in his diaries, lists the punishments of several different men to show the harshness of Norfolk Island. Here are the highlights of Michael Burns. He got 300 lashes and jail for conspiring to burn a building. Upon his release from that, he was immediately rearrested for being too far from the gate. This led to 3 months of solitary for singing a song, 300 lashes for insolence, 100 lashes for singing, 2 months for sending a doctor to an ill inmate, 300 lashes and irons for robbery, 250 lashes spread out over time for being too ill to work. Overall, he suffered 2,100 lashes in 2 years. After a while, Norfolk Island got a new head, Major Ryan, who was more progressive but constantly suffered from ill health. During his time governing the island, punishments were reduced. He had to leave the island after falling very ill due to overseeing the convicts help the survivors of a shipwreck and attempt the rescue of some of those who couldn't be saved from the currents. Thomas Cook did well in his efforts with the shipwreck, and his assistance was remembered by the supervisors. Major Ryan was replaced by his second-in-command, who was harsher, but not the worst of the overseers, until Major Ryan was well enough to leave. When Major Ryan left, Thomas Cook gave him a letter of thanks from the convicts. He was replaced eventually by a Captain McConaughey, who removed corporal punishment from all but the worst cases, and instead granted privileges that could be revoked, such as gardens and free time. Thomas Cook flourished under this new system, and became an overseer and eventually Captain McConaughey's clerk. Thomas Cook was well behaved for a few years, and decided to ask the courts to commute his life sentence at Norfolk Island to time served, and thus be able to leave with just a few more years of his original 14 left to serve. He got letters of support from Captain McConaughey, several higher members of the Royal Engineers, the island's chaplain, the surgeon, the superintendent of convicts, and also some men of the Royal Navy. He also got a petition of support from Whitchurch, with signatures from William Churton, the one he wrote a letter threatening, William Smith, 3 separate curates, George Corser, and Edward Tudman. The governor, on receipt of these letters, granted Thomas Cook an appearance before the court in Sydney. Just before he left Norfolk Island, he gave Captain McConaughey a transcript of his memoirs, and upon reaching Australia's shores, quickly disappeared. McConaughey eventually gives these memoirs to a publisher in England, and he mentions that he didn't know where Cook currently was, but he couldn't stay in this land any longer, and that he believed he'd gone to France. The transcript was eventually printed, and remains the main detailed personal account of a convict who was transported.